Supervisors and private practitioners should have knowledge of different worldviews, not necessarily their own, and they should understand how that knowledge may be beneficial in their role as a supervisor or program manager. Chapter 2.3 addresses faith-based modalities, and you should understand generally the 15 major tenets of humanistic versus corresponding Christian beliefs identified, as well as know and understand the 17 core competencies identified within this chapter for faith-based AOD counselors. Please note that the inclusion of this chapter in the exam is not as an advocate of any particular faith-based modality, but only to make sure that supervisors and private practitioners understand the existence of these approaches and how they may be beneficial and or impact the practice and or supervising other counselors. In Chapter 2.4, understand how the role of the clinical supervisor in the addiction treatment field has evolved. The variation of levels of higher education among staff as they vary from state to state. No information about the Pacific Southwest Addiction Technology Transfer Center survey about the number of counselors that had degrees or did not have degrees, as well as the results of a 2007 nationwide survey of drug abuse treatment units that discussed how many of their counselor workforce individuals had graduate degrees. Understand that treatment services are moving away from the paradigm of a client fitting into the program and toward a new paradigm where the program fits itself into the needs of the client. Understand who coined the term wounded healer and what that means, and also understand about and be able to distinguish between the 4 areas of biomedical ethics. Understand, for example, that a common intervention used by an overwhelmed counselor is the use of excessive self-disclosure. This self-disclosure also has to do with transference, countertransference, which will be discussed later in the book, but certainly understand the concepts in this chapter about countertransference and how the clinical supervisor's relationship with the counselor can provide an example of the appropriate client-counselor relationship. Leadership is an essential element of both clinical supervision and management, and you will be responsible for all of the material in this chapter. You should study it, know it well, because there will be a good number of questions in the exam based on the information in this chapter. Know and understand the various leadership theories and styles discussed in this chapter. Know the common leadership characteristics as well as their order of importance. Know, understand, and be able to distinguish between the various categories of leaders suggested within the managerial grid, and be able to distinguish between the categories of leaders suggested by the participative leadership theory. Finally, know and understand very well the contingency theory of leadership and the path-goal theory of leadership, and be able to distinguish between the two of those. Chapter 2.6 involves a case study. You will not be responsible for the facts of this particular case study, but you should know and understand the components of the 4 distinct areas of concern identified in the case study, the major challenges of clinical supervision in an AOD program. Again, you will not be responsible for the specific facts in this case study, but you should absolutely know the concepts of what happened and what should have been corrected in this factual pattern. Chapter 2.7 is a very short chapter, but you should know all of the information on the first 2 pages, which is the strategic and tactical planning differences. Know what they are, know what strategic planning is, know what tactical planning is, and know what the differences are so that you can distinguish between the two of them. Chapter 2.8 discusses sexual harassment, how to prevent it, what it is, and the employer's responsibilities in making sure that their employees and their staff do not engage in sexual harassment. Know and understand what can be considered sexual harassment. Know what the federal law is that is violated when sexual harassment takes place. Know how the EEOC defines sexual harassment. Know and understand the standards used by the courts in determining whether sexual harassment took place, and understand the term reasonable person and how that works into the standard. And also know the meaning of and differences between both quid pro quo sexual harassment and hostile environment harassment. Chapter 3.1 discusses counselor development, and you should know the factors of success in treatment identified by this chapter. Know, understand, and be able to distinguish between the suggested motivations for becoming a counselor. And know and understand the suggested methods of keeping counselors mentally healthy and motivated. This is another short chapter which contains a lot of information that may be tested on in the exam. Know and understand the meaning of transference and how it manifests itself in the client-counselor relationship. Know and understand Carl Rogers' theory on conditions for therapeutic change. Know and understand the 3 personal characteristics or attitudes that help in the therapeutic relationship, and be able to distinguish between those characteristics of congruence, unconditional positive regard, and accurate empathetic understanding. In other chapters of this book, we've discussed transference and countertransference. Chapter 3.3 discusses what to do with that information and when and why these issues should be addressed with counselors. Understand the methods by which a supervisor can detect the presence of countertransference and why and how live supervision is important. Know what supervisor questions may be helpful in determining the presence of transference and countertransference issues. Know and understand the different methods available when countertransference issues necessitate more attention than usual. And know and understand the approaches and techniques that supervisors can recommend to counselors in order to help reduce fatigue and burnout. You have undoubtedly already sat through many hours of ethics courses, but Chapter 3.4 wants the clinical supervisor and private practitioner to understand the reason that professional standards are developed. Understand the 4 major purposes intended by the enactment of the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, and understand the holding of Tarasoff versus Regents of University of California and what that decision means to addiction treatment programs. Chapter 3.5 discusses the operations functions of agencies, and you should understand why it is important for supervisors to be aware of the operations function of the agency in which they work. Know the 4 common sources of information used to measure actual performance. And know, understand, and be able to distinguish between the various qualities of an effective control system. Supervising recovering counselors is an important component of our responsibilities as program managers and supervisors. Understand the developmental stages of recovery and why that understanding is important to a supervisor and a manager. Know and understand the components of confrontation counseling as suggested in the article by Donald Clark. Know, understand, and be able to distinguish between the various components of performance evaluations and the related management responsibilities. Know and understand the management-employee communication barriers and how those barriers can be overcome. And know and understand conflict management as well as conflict resolution options to reduce the conflict.